All right, welcome to Inside My Canoe Head, a podcast about individual emergency preparedness, policy-related issues, adventure, life, seeking the brilliance of happiness. Sit back and enjoy. All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoe Head. Hope you like that new opening. We're working on some new things at the podcast. We are going live on our YouTube channel coming up on the 28th of April. That will mark the 2-year anniversary of this podcast being launched as a project in the beginnings of a pandemic when we knew far less than we did right now. The goal of this relaunch is simple. We are going to try to broaden the reach of Inside My Canoe Head. We're going to hit a lot more social media platforms. The idea being is we're going to try to create a community, a bunch of people who enjoy this. We're just going to have a lot of fun. This is not one of those models where, I'm going to try to hit 5,000 subscribers and then I'm going to give a Patreon. We're going to put some stuff behind a Patreon. No, listen, there'll be buttons there if you want to send me a coffee or all that other stuff. I don't care. Listen, I do this because I think there's value in providing a reasonably well-educated opinion on the preparedness world that we all live in. And as well, I think that we need to have a space where we can have some frank, sometimes hilarious, but realistic discussions about wrapping ourselves in this world of individual emergency preparedness and the policy that affects that in the 21st century, especially in today's time. So that brings to today's topic. Listen, it was I had a lot of issues trying to figure out how to wrap my head around to bring what's happening in Ukraine into a podcast. Now, I did a previous one on preparations for war, on some ideas for people who may find themselves inadvertently directly in the situation. And I've got a lot of feedback from that, especially from one very important listener who regularly gives me feedback, positive and negative, which I sincerely enjoy. And I realize that there's a piece missing here. There's this, what does it mean for me? So how do I take the totality of what is happening on the other side of the world in Europe, and how does that affect me wherever I may be on this face of this earth? What are those implications of what is going on my news cycle? So today we're going to hit that. Today we are going to talk about the implications of Putin's war. And this entire conversation is going to be based upon you and the implications that will affect you. And when I thought about how to do this, the first time was, let's just do an episode on what it's like to live through nuclear war. And I'm like, yeah, okay. In other words, let's talk about a horror novel. I don't think everybody wants to do that. We're going to do a little bit of that today, but I don't think anybody really wants to live through a 30-minute or more horror novel. The second part is, will you fight? Let's do a bravado, gung-ho, ex-military guy grabbing his gear, getting on a plane and going to Ukraine to whack some heads. There's a lot of people who feel that way. And if you are a military veteran of any sort or a law enforcement official, you see this kind of death and destruction being put on a bunch of people who really had no choice in the entire matter. And you want to fight. You want to get your gear and you want to go whack some heads and turn the tide of history. I get it. I completely understand that. Yeah, I can't really do 30 minutes on that. And then it was about mobility. Do we frame this podcast discussion in your ability to be mobile and get out of the way? Get out of the way, get out of the way. You know that song that's on Instagram all the time? Is that what we need to do? I wasn't sure. So we're going to start the framing of the discussions of how did we get here? And to figure out how we got here, I think we have to roll back to 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement. And a lot of people are rolling their eyes. Oh, dear Lord, here we go. A history lesson. But the point being is the Bretton Woods Agreement was initially designed to be a unified way of building policies that provided the framework to establish currency exchanges. So basically setting the conditions for the post-World War II economic environment that would facilitate a world rebuild. That was the above politics public face of Bretton Woods. Reality, what Bretton Woods really was, it was an agreement that was subsequently reaffirmed, shall we say, in 1946, that basically said, listen, America was the accidental superpower. They were the folks that woke up and realized they were on top of the world. Their Navy is the only one really 2 years post-war that remained largely intact. The enemies, of course, the Axis navies were dismantled, and most of the other Western navies just basically shut her down. And so the Americans said, listen, we've got the Soviet problem that just popped up out of nowhere. We didn't think this would be an issue. Here we are. You have a decision to make. And they said this to the entire world. You pick one side or the other. You're either for us or you're against us. If you sign up with us and be on our side versus Soviet communism, we will provide security of economic good transport. So essentially, it was the American Navy guaranteeing freedom of the seas in that there would be no interference in your ability to conduct economic trade. And that's a big deal. Still to this day in the 21st century, the vast majority of our goods that we build and exchange between societies in this planet, they go on the ocean. And ladies and gentlemen, like, they only get where they're supposed to go because there's a military that's willing to defend the right of freedom of the seas. You got to remember in the 17, 18, 1900s, all the way back to 1100 if you want to, piracy was the name of the game. If I saw a ship, I took it, especially if it was under a flag of somebody I didn't like. And a lot of times you heard of the privateers. And the privateers were private sailors who had ships who would be paid by a government to go raid the other guy's shipping channels. This was normalcy. Right up until the start of the Second World War, piracy on the high seas was standard operating procedure for movement of goods. It was only the Bretton Woods Agreement and the establishment of the United States Navy as securing that for everybody that we turned into a society where you had large amounts of goods traveling the seas, free from interference, and you had economic growth. In fact, I'm not going to get into it today, but if you want to know why China is as powerful now, is they signed on to Bretton Woods on the American side, and America facilitated the growth of the Chinese empire by allowing its freedom of trade. And then we had the collapse of the Cold War, which everybody lauded and thought it was an absolutely wonderful thing. And then here we are where countries didn't need the Bretton Woods Agreement anymore because there wasn't the thought of Russian interference with trade and shipping. The U.S. Navy's protection really wasn't required anymore. So you start to see the collapse of a whole bunch of systems that held the world together. And so the big thing that you see with Vladimir Putin is and you got to understand, like, he was one of the last people that was educated in the days of the Soviet Union when it was all rah, 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 motherland. He was in the KGB. So you got to understand, like, he's in his late 60s. A lot of the senior military leadership, they all came from the same generation where it's all about the motherland. But the vast majority of the population of Russia was born under perestroika and the idea of glasnost and freedom. Reasonable freedom, but you understand what I mean. So the country's population is not of the generation of Vladimir Putin. He follows a mantra that the rest of the... And it's not that they've dismissed it, it's just they were never educated in that way. So when something is grilled in your head about the motherland and the fatherland and doing this everything for Mother Russia and we must persevere, and you got that, imagine, for 12 years of school and throughout your university education, and then you went to work for the KGB as a spy in support of that, that's your frame of reference for looking at the world. The rest of the population doesn't, but his generation is the last one that was trained that way. So you have to understand, as disgusting as it may be, to look at the world through the lens of Vladimir Putin if you want to understand why the man is doing what he's doing. You know, there's a great article that said, listen, the whole goal of Vladimir Putin is to maintain the positive relationship and control of the three Slavic nations, which is Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. And they must all be under the same sphere of influence or the whole project collapses. So I'm not going to go into any more than that about the history of it, but understand that I have always said that Vladimir Putin is probably the most brilliant leader on the world stage, and I defend that I don't defend this action, obviously. I don't think anybody really can. But if you understand who Vladimir Putin is, the way he was educated and what he believes in, you'll understand why he's doing what he's doing from his view. Not logical, but from his view. So when we look at what we're talking about today, and we're talking about the implications of Vladimir Putin's move on all of us, the first thing that we have to talk about is, let's be frank, the mental health implications of this are real. Like, let's not kid ourselves. The reality of watching a Western city in chaos, whether it be Kharkov, whether it be Kyiv or Kiev, however you properly pronounce it, we in the Western part, developed world, are seeing a city that looks like ours, people living a life like we do, that are abjectly on the turn of a dime, facing harms and threats and death and missiles hitting their apartment blocks, something that is just unfathomably understandable for somebody in a Western society. Now, we have seen war. I have seen war face to face. When you see war in a developing country, it's almost understandable, because this is something a country has to go through to get to the developed stage, right? So when you see conflict in developing countries, it's horrible, it's disgusting, it is tragic, but it's almost a rite of passage to get to the world. But when we see a Western city with people who speak our language and people who have the same type of economic lives that we live, of all different ethnicities, of all different races, creeds, and colors, and they're facing this kind of, it's just difficult to wrap your head around that. It's very difficult for us to put ourselves in that case. Can you imagine, just if you would think about it, and I'm sure you have to some extent, think about walk outside and look at the towers in your residence, in your city, and where you are, and imagine missiles hitting that. Imagine being stuck in your apartment and looking down or looking out of your house window in the street and seeing a foreign enemy and their armored vehicles and dismounted troops coming down your street. Now, that's just not within the normal psychological idea of how we look at ourselves and our society. But what it does bring out is absolute compassion. It brings out empathy, but it also brings out anger. And I spoke before about, would you fight, and the ability to go fight. And now there's a lot of, even the foreign secretary of the UK has come out and said she understands and supports the decisions of members of the UK society to get on a plane and go to Ukraine to fight. And there is now movements of people starting to put together private security companies that are looking for benefactors who will pay for the contract to bring together American and British former special forces are now putting together packages to go in to secure and to combat Russian troops. And I'm sure there's some Ukrainian billionaires who are footing a few of those bills, shall we say. But then we have to think about the mental health aspect is real, because it's really how it affects a lot of us. Because here in the Western society, nothing is blowing up. For the most part, my life looks the same as it did before. The challenge is the mental health and framing myself around that. But the threat of nuclear war. Now, I'm 51 years old, so I grew up in the Cold War. I remember the school drills of flash, 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 get down below your desk, put your hands over your head, and cover for inbound impact of a nuclear detonation. Just call it the modern equivalence of an active shooter drill. Like in high schools today, they do active shooter drills, right? So when I was a kid, we did active nuclear detonation drills. So we had drills just like you. It was just something a little bit somewhat different. But none of us right up after, especially after the end of the Cold War, really wrapped our heads around the fact that this was even remotely fathomably possible, that somebody would come this close to using rhetoric about the use of nuclear weapons. Now, the employment that he is referring to in many of his broadcasts is all about the use of tactical nuclear weapons. Now, they jokingly call them low-yield nuclear detonations, but they've been always designed on the battle space, and it's part of the Russian doctrine that when they lose and they start getting to a certain point of loss and the threat to the actual motherland, shall we say, is real, then it's okay to use a tactical nuclear detonation over top of an advancing enemy division or several divisions, because you can kill 30 or 40,000 troops in one shot. Why wouldn't you? It makes logical sense in warfare. But that's what they're talking about. The problem with the use of tactical nuclear weapons in the case that they're referring to now in Putin's world, he's referring to two sides of a coin. One side is the threat against any of the Western nations who get involved. Their troops cross the border from Latvia and start coming into Russia, they're going to get hit with a nuclear weapon. That's because most of his combat power is in Ukraine. He doesn't have a backup reserve of 100,000 troops that he could swing fire north to block an advance coming in from the Baltic nations. If you understand the geopolitical map, think about it. His combat power right now, for all intents and purposes, is engaged in Ukraine or on the borders, ready to be engaged in Ukraine as a reserve. He doesn't have the combat power remaining to fight a NATO advance into Russia, which means he's telling you, or telling all of us, that his response to that is an immediate escalation to a nuclear detonation. Pretty clear message to NATO nations. You cross into Russia and I will kill every one of your soldiers in one shot. So the other side of the coin is employing it in the Ukrainian theater. There is no mass body of Ukrainian troops that represents any lucrative target. In other words, there's not this massive defensive position that they could hit to kill a bunch of people that would make a difference. So there's two ways to employ it in Ukraine. One, there's to pick a military target outside of a populated area and to detonate a low-yield nuclear weapon as a message to every other Ukrainian. In other words, just like the Americans did to Japan, I'm going to fry one of your smaller cities. I'm going to kill a couple, 100,000 people. But if you want to save 40 million, stop now. Surrender. End the fight. That's one message. The other message is to actually use the tactical nuclear weapon to decapitate the government. And that would mean securing the avenue of approaches to Kiev and then essentially nuking the city of Kiev. And I'll just leave it at that because that does decapitate the government and it sends a message to the people of Ukraine that it's time to shut her down. It's we're all going to get fried by nuclear bombs, so we're done. That idea has to this week been so out of the sphere of normal consideration that none of us have even considered that to be a possibility. And the finer part about nuclear that is so difficult for all of us is this is, as we see it now, irrespective of how this works out, this is the totality of the end of peace as we knew it. The world thought, for whatever reason, good, bad, and different, I don't care whether you support it or not, but as the Cold War ended, people were under the impression that the world got a peace dividend. We could largely demilitarize the size of our militaries. We could back down from our fingers on the nuclear trigger, and we could go on with perfecting this thing called the human experience and humanity. That ended this week, my friends. That ended. That is over. I don't care what side of the coin you're on. All the armies in the West are rearming. Far more than Donald Trump could ever do. Vladimir Putin has now ensured that every NATO nation will hit 2% of GDP, save Canada, but that's a discussion for another day. And what a lot of scholars have written about for years and public policy analysts that look at this have said, it goes back to Adam Smith's original treatise on the wealth of nations. And one of the first things he says that a nation must have is a strong and robust army. And the purposes of a strong and robust army is so that your opponent, should they choose to become an opponent, realizes that they will pay such a high price for fighting you and combating you that they don't. It's the art of deterrence. That is what the world is turning to. So we are going to be pouring more and more of our finite money into defense so that we have this, once again, massively well-equipped and trained defense capability that will act as a robust deterrence. And that is the necessary evil in today's world when you're looking with people like Vladimir Putin. And he can freely, and there will be more Putins. There will be many more of them. This is the fallout again. And many scholars have talked about this. The rise of the dictators is coming in many different parts of the world where they will start to see this as a freedom of decision to use their armies to invade foreign nations. And the only way to do that, or should I say prevent that, is to have a robust army yourself. So sorry about the peaceniks and all the people that thought we were going to reduce the percent of military GDP and send it and build affordable housing. You've now come a long second place in case that decision wasn't already made. So here we go. And that's the effect, the end of the peace as we know it and the security of the world as we understood it has now come to an end. It's like the end of the pandemic. We've already reached the end of the pandemic. It's just the majority of people are still, from an evidence perspective, we're there. But from a mental health and a view standard, there's still the vast majority of people who think we're in the middle of a fight, that we're currently fighting the pandemic. We're trying to reduce the spread of the pandemic, reduce its reach, protect the healthcare system. There's still people in that mental health space. They haven't moved along the realization that you're living in a world with COVID-19. It will probably kill 5,000 to 10,000 Canadians every year. There will be 500 to 700 in ICU at all times, time immemorial with COVID-19. This is just the future of the world. And as we had, that's a hard thing to wrap your head around. And a lot of people haven't got there. And I completely understand it. But that's the reality of the world. And it's no different that the reality of the world now is that the peace dividend and the security we thought existed, it doesn't anymore. It is gone. So now you live in a world where the rise of individual small and medium-sized dictators are real, that as Vladimir Putin's foreign minister himself said, we are going to start looking at each other now between binoculars and gun sights and not across a negotiation table. If that phrase doesn't tell you the intent of the future of the Russian regime and the dictators they will influence later, then you've got your eyes way too closed on the world. So the big implication, let's talk supply chains. I love supply chains, right? I spent 20 plus years supply chain management. A lot of the principles that I learned in that professional education through school, through earning my professional logistics designation as the Logistics Institute in Toronto. I learned so much about how the world is interchanging, and let's be frank, this is the final nail in the coffin of globalization. So all of you out there who somehow believe that the idea of globalization still retains a piece of reality in not only societal relationships, but in economic relationships, it's done. It's like the peace dividend. Globalization started dying on the second half of the second term of Bill Clinton. And every U.S. president since then has been hitting the acceleration pedal. I mean, let's be frank, George Bush's Jr.'s idea was to isolate the United States of America from the rest of the world, cut off trade, and go back to the 1940s era of America being isolationist, just being incredibly wonderful on their own. And then 9/11 happened, and it kind of forced his hand back into the global environment. But his intent, his whole election campaign, George Bush Jr., was to be an isolationist president and get America the heck out of the world system. That was his intent. Obama after him, no different. He said a lot of great words, and I paid to go see the man speak. He's a brilliant orator, but if you look at his policies, they were very much orientated on pulling America out of the global system. Donald Trump, it is what it is. I still think was the best president the U.S. ever had since George Bush Sr. His number one success was the trade policy. So Donald Trump rewrote American trade policy in 4 years from what the two predecessors couldn't do in 16. One member of his cabinet that survived the entire 4-year craziness that was Donald Trump was his trade secretary Lighthizer. And what he did is he went around the world and he signed bilateral trade agreements with major nations in the world. And the point is that America is a massive elephant, so you want to trade with mice because then you have a massive amount of influence. When you enter, like the TTP was a 17-country trade pact in Pacific, you're diluting American power, influence, and ability to bully. And I don't care what you think, economic nationalism calls for you to be a bully where you can. Okay? So America needed bilateral trade agreements. So Trump went around and canceled all of the multilateral ones, and then he engaged in bilateral ones with the 5 to 6 areas that mattered. Everybody else he ignored. All right? So he was basically saying that whether, you're Japan, you're South Korea, you're the European Union, you're NAFTA, and a very few others, you matter to the U.S., you make up 80 to 90% of our trade. We really don't care about anybody else. We'll do open trade, we'll put tariffs on other people and do what we want. And these agreements were bully agreements. And there's a lot of stories about Lighthizer sitting in the room and he wouldn't even put the devices in his ears that would translate what the other people were saying. It's basically, here's the trade deal we're going to sign. It's not about what you want to negotiate. This, if you want to deal with the United States of America, the largest economy in the face of this earth, this is what you will sign. And he did, and it worked. So how do I know it was brilliant? How do I know it was the best thing? Because for all the things that Biden said in the campaign and the Democrats, they haven't ripped up a single trade agreement. And if you want to understand why this was the correct move, and even the Democrats back it, is look who the Democrats have put in as their trade czar when they came in Biden's cabinet. It's an absolute brilliant attorney. They brought in a woman who has the absolute reputation of being ruthless on contract enforcement. She has zero experience whatsoever in knowledge in negotiating trade pacts. She's there to do one thing, to ensure that the Trump-signed trade pacts are absolutely and irrevocably enforced to their fullest extent, or you will fight the United States of America. And the reason that that's important is understand that that's the supply chains that matter. So if you're in international governance of supply chains, if you're looking at global supply chains, you need to move to where the protection, the security, and the certainty is. Businesses hate uncertainty. So you're asking yourself, why is he blabbing about this and how does this influence me? So supply chains over the next short number of years are going to move into these trading blocks. So be it NAFTA, be it the European Union, be it ASEAN, AESAN, which is the Southeast Asia Trading Pact. Things that exist within, trading, construction, distributions, retails, etc., within these trading pacts is where businesses are going to go. The idea of building, taking source inputs from 12 different countries, bringing them to one country, constructing it, and then sending that out to 4 different trading zones. That global supply chain idea is dead. Now, a lot of people are still hanging on to it, but it's dead. If you're an innovator, if you're a broad thinker in the innovation space, you're already moving to, I need to reshore my supply chain for North America. So if you want to sell in the United States of America, you need to produce it within the United States of America supply trading relationship. So as long as one of those countries you're using and all of those countries are within that trading relationship, you're fine. How does that influence you? Well, I asked on many other, podcast episodes, are you aware of your exposure to international supply chains? So the first thing that you have to do to understand how this affects you, and this is where we're going now after 29 minutes, is you individually in your house, how this matters. So the products that you and your family consume are what you access from the international supply chain. You are the only one that knows what they are and where they come from. Read the boxes, understand where you get your clothing, the equipment from your leisure activities, understand where your diapers are made, understand where your paper product, like you need to become aware of your exposure to the global supply chain. So as it disintegrates, which it will do, and get reshored and reconstructed elsewhere, i.e. supply chain disruptions are probably going to be here for a decade or so before the system gets fully realigned in its new reality of inside these trading networks. Your exposure to that global supply chain means products are going to be disruptive in their ability, and disruptive supply chains cause price hikes. So things that are global now and have to go through a transformation will become more expensive, and their availability will be more periodic and not consistent. Things that are already within a North American, a European supply chain are going to be more price and deliverable consistent. Now understand that a lot of these supply chains have exposure to, like, East European supply chains based in Western Europe are fine. European supply chain that are based in Eastern Europe have influences because a lot of their raw material come out of Russia, the Caucasus Mountains, areas like that. And so because of that, that's exposure. Does it matter? Well, I don't know. What do you use on a daily basis that's exceptionally important to you that if it's no longer available or price disrupted is going to have a significant impact on how you live your life? I mean, that's you, right? That's understanding your exposure. I can't tell you the following things aren't going to work. I can tell you that you need to understand that exposure to that international supply chain as they get reshored and re-solidified in the new network. Those price disruptions are going to last probably for a decade. Inflation is not going anywhere whatsoever for at least the next 3 to 4 years. So 5 to 7% inflation on all your core CPI index items, food, that's just standard. It's just the way it is. You can, I mean, I understand the anger and the upset about that, but you have to realize, hey, this is the world. Put your stoic hat on and say, okay, now what do I do? How do I figure out everything that I want to buy that's not produced in my, in a very small local area in North America? It's going to go up by 5 to 7%. Then everything that's not made within, say, 100, 200 kilometers of my house is probably going to be price disrupted over the next 10 years. That is a big sit-down coffee event, if you ask me, with a piece of paper, a pen, or a podcast mic, and have a conversation with yourself about these things and how it affects your ability to access what you need. So how does it influence your preparation discussion? So does this change your outlook on individual emergency preparedness for you and your family? Maybe it does. It should first, like I just said, about your exposure to supply chains and what is not made locally and that, is really critical for what you do. And I think what you need to look at is that time horizon that you've selected for your family's emergency preparedness. I want to be prepared for X number of hours, days, weeks, months, whatever that decision you've made. And we've talked about in many other episodes how to get there. When you made that time decision, do you need now to reflect on that and maybe accelerate that to, let's just say, bump it up a month or something that gives you a little bit more? Because it's about how comfortable you feel. And we talked about risk perception and risk tolerance, and everybody's going to be a little bit different on that. But what is your risk perception? If you feel a little anxious right now, if you have a higher degree of concern, other than a nuclear conflict, which we're going to talk about in a minute, just in instability and conflict in general in the world, the end of globalization, how this affects you, if that brings you a bit of concern, then the easiest solution to that is to extend your time horizon. Like I did, about 4 months ago, I announced that I was moving from 60 days prepared to 90 days prepared. That's a conscious decision I made based upon how I saw events happening in the world, that for me, in the position I'm in, where I live, my family construction, etc., that put me in a better place at where I was before at 60 days. And now that I've raised the bells, I've officially reached 90 days preparedness level. I'm now thinking this conflict has got me to think about a little bit more. I'm not sure if I want to go beyond 90 days, Because remember, 90 days preparation means I don't expect society to right itself for 90 days. That's a pretty significant event that would have to happen to get us to that point. So think about your time horizon, and then this would be a good time to have a quick look back across your preparedness, like all your food, your animalistic requirements, right? Your food, your shelter, your food, your water, your health, and your security, your 5 animalistic requirements. How are we doing? If you have elderly or young, they have special considerations, be it diapers, formula, or medicines, prescriptions, that type of thing. If you're worried about having trauma kits and medicines on hand, there's a couple of great recent episodes on Canadian Prepper. Now, he is getting a bit apocalyptic on me, but he's got one on how Canadians can order a stockpile of prescription antibiotics from an American distributor. It's all legal. It's all there, how to do it. He talks about the survival medicine handbook that teaches you about how to deal with some pretty significant events when help is not coming, i.e., a member of your family has a traumatic incident. There's no 911. Nobody's available to help you. What is your plan to deal with that? Those type of preparedness things, I think, need a little bit of reflection. But again, it's not a panic. Don't ever think situations like this induce panic. If they induce anxiety, it's a good idea to sit back and pour yourself your favorite beverage and sit back and think about how I've already done this, how I've already been successful in positioning myself and my family for a better outcome. Now I need to have another look at just make sure that I didn't miss something. And then think don't think about, oh my Lord, am I missing something? Think about time horizon. Think about how long you want to be prepared for. Think about the implications. With that, we are now going to talk about, and those of you who don't want to talk about nuclear war, this is the time to end the episode. But now we're going to talk about the actual and real preparations for living in and surviving a nuclear detonation in your area in a Western world. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is unfathomable, but it's a real possibility because of somebody's threatening to press a button. So, in reality, a nuclear detonation in your area, unless you're probably in modern warfare about 20 kilometers outside the initial detonation point of expected arrival of nuclear weapons, you're done. Okay, let's just not beat around the bush. So if you're outside that 20-kilometer zone, your ability to survive is going to be based upon what you do in the first 2 weeks. You have to be able to create a space and a place where you and the people you love can go to be cut off from outside air for 2 weeks and protected from the fallout. And the fallout is basically when a nuclear detonation goes off, you see the mushroom cloud. What it's doing is it's sucking up all this ground up into the cloud. The cloud is absolutely radiated. All that material becomes radiated. It then falls down. That's fallout. So it's the fallout that's radiation. There's gamma and alpha radiation flying through the air, but again, you have to be outside to be exposed to that. And you're around a couple of corners, you're good. So what we're concerned about is the actual nuclear fallout, nuclear contaminated, radiated fallout that comes down from the sky after detonation. Okay, that's the biggest threat. So be it in the basement of your house, which is the most important thing because the top part of your house may likely get blown off. If it catches on fire, you're screwed. I don't know what else to tell you. If you have a bomb shelter in the backyard, a tornado shelter or something, you need to be able to stay in there for 2 weeks. The idea being is that with food and water supplies for at least 2 weeks, sanitation supplies, and ability to cut off the air by blocking entrances with duct tape and tarps. And I mean duct tape, like no airflow in there whatsoever. You're going to survive on the quality of air that's in there. And so the air space has to be big enough to hold sufficient oxygen for you and your family for that period of time. The reason being is after 2 weeks, 97% of the radiation risk is over. It's literally over, other than if you pick up and chew the ground and stuff. And we'll get to that in a second. But your ability to be radiated just by being outside is 90% over after 2 weeks. If you make it through those 2 weeks, you then have the ability to rise and leave and start exploring what's going on around you, who made it, who didn't, and start searching for supplies, because you're going to need a lot of supplies. Now, number one, when it comes to your animalistic requirements, you're going to need particulate gas mask filters for everybody for being outside, all right? Those are the particulate ones, the P3, I think they are. Anyhow, go to mirasafety.com. They'll have it all on there. Not the ones to worry about radiation. You're looking for particulate. And the reason being is the radiation ones are better, but they only last 20 to 30 minutes and they're really expensive. So I'd go with a particulate filter on a gas mask every time you leave. When you go outside, you cover yourself in a set of rain gear and duct tape it so that any fallout that falls on you, it stays on the rain gear. Radiated particles, can be washed off of you with just general soap. So as part of preparedness for nuclear operations, you are going to have a large amount of soap and water for washing yourself off, because that's literally how you stay safe, is using lots of it. The truth is you're going to have to probably have about or access to 2 years of food supply. The reason being is the effects of the radiation on the ground and the contamination of the water supply is going to take at least that long for ground soil to become ability to produce food that is edible by the human. Now, scientists are back and forth on this. 2 years is the general consensus on the minimal acceptable time before we will be able to grow. And the effects of nuclear winter, again, the blocking out of the sun, the no ability for photosynthesis to happen in plants. There's a lot of material out there. The sense is we're not sure, but we think it will be in consensus 2 years before the world, nature, as we say, has the ability to produce food for us again. So you're going to need to be responsible for food for 2 years. On top of that, you're also going to consider you're going to need potassium iodine, which are pills that are non-radioactive iodine. With correct doses right before or during an exposure to airborne radiation, it blocks or reduces the amount of radioactive iodine that is taken into the thyroid. So these are the pills that are given out in Canada. You can access them if you live in what's considered a fallout zone for a nuclear accident at one of the reactors. They're great to have on hand for you and your family members, the appropriate dose for them, to start taking them the daily dose during those first 2 weeks of a nuclear exposure. Longer if you have it. Long-term use is not highly recommended for human health, but it's a nuclear detonation, so let's be serious. But the potassium iodine tablets or droplets, depending on how you use them, are very important to have for you the first 2 weeks. So understanding that the earth is not going to be around and provide you sustenance for 2 years. That's the standard you got to understand. If you survive those 2 weeks, the house didn't burn down on you, you and your loved ones have now made it through the nuclear detonation phase. Now you're looking at, how do I survive? How do I construct life from this point forward? Now, I'm going to give you Jeff's solution to the nuclear apocalypse. This is how I think you should prepare to survive. Number one, mobility. You got to be in the right location. All right. You have to have the animalistic requirements, but most important is going to be health and security. And the reason I say that is you're going to be surrounded by a whole bunch of sick people who survive for some reason, somehow, but have not taken the preparatory things, and they're going to be looking to get whatever they need to save their families, the same as you would be. So security is really, really important. So having a group of like-minded people, or even better, having a friend or a family member who has a rural property outside of a likely detonation zone of a nuclear event that you can go to post-event, because you're probably not going to be able to get there, because most of us will likely get 20 to 30 minutes, if we get any notice at all, that a detonation is imminent. We're going to have a place to go to when we survive those 2 weeks and we emerge to start going. So you have take my 90 days, for example. So this is Jeff's solution to the apocalypse. I have 90 days of food and water capability. Now my decision is I have consumed 2 weeks of that surviving the nuclear apocalypse. I now have 2.5 months worth of supplies, and I have the ability to put those in mobility equipment. So basically bicycles with bicycle trailers, those kid trailers, and there are some robust bicycles, because let's just put it this way, maybe you can count on your car working, maybe you can't, I don't know. I'd prefer to use the car. It's a lot easier to get to the farm where I'm going to, but let's just put it this way, bicycles are an option. I have the ability to move that to that location, all right? So I have the mobility. I can take the supplies that I need to put onto these devices and go. Mobility is number one. Security, I've got that taken care of. We'll just leave it at that. I have to protect 3 things to make my family survive. I have to protect my ability to grow food. I have to protect my ability to purify water. And I have to be able to provide shelter. So what I have is 3 things. I have Jeff's supply kit includes a portable greenhouse that's easy to construct, that'll enable me to grow food in a controlled environment. I have a portable shelter with a portable wood stove that allows me basically keep the elements off my family and to keep them warm and reasonably secure. And the last part is about food and water. So the idea is I have soil. I know I'm going to have to be able to grow food because I can't kill and hunt animals and things like that for a while until nature cleans that up. Right? So I need to protect the soil because the soil will get contaminated if it's left outside. So as part of my nuclear preparations is sufficient soil. Now, I'm a fan of the Square Foot Gardening book. You look at that, it'll tell you exactly what you need. You can figure out how much soil you need to be able to grow food sufficient and dense enough to provide sustaining calories for you and your family. Because again, 2 years of food is really hard to store in your basement. Yeah, you can do it, fair enough. But it's expensive and difficult to manage and almost impossible to move on mobility if you got to go. So I have that soil elements. I have seeds of many different heirloom environments to ensure I can pull the seeds out, dry them, and reuse them. So ideally, I hope I never have to use it, but I have the ability in Jeff's solution to build one of those portable small greenhouses, put a bunch of soil in there, and start growing calorie-dense food. Like number 1 is potatoes, right? Absolutely, unequivocally potatoes. Squashes, beans, the 3 sisters. Very, very simplistic, basic stuff, but it's about being able to produce sufficient nutrient profile and calories to keep my family alive. I don't think anybody's won the award for the ability to purify water post-radiation. The best that we have at about 70% effectiveness is reverse osmosis, which is essentially a system that using high pressure pushes water through a membrane. They sell them for your house and whatever. They can become portable if you want. You're going to need a power source for them. So to do that, I use, as I've said before, my Jackery power box and my solar panel to be able to generate that, to be able to push water through this membrane. 2 years of water. I got a family of 4. That's 8 liters of water a day. 8 times 700 and 800 days. I mean, you're talking 64,000 liters of water, folks. Like, I'm not storing that in my house. I don't care who you are. I'm not doing that. So the point being is and mobility, that makes it impossible, right? So that's not happening. The point being here is that those are the considerations you need to survive the nuclear apocalypse. If you're outside that 20 kilometers and you make it and you survive those 14 days, you're able to move now. Get a gas mask with a particulate filter. You have to have a place to go. Staying in an urban city center where it's going to be difficult to procure and grow food is not impossible. It's just challenging depending on your social capital, the neighborhood you have. I have family friends who have a farm 100 kilometers outside of town. I have different mobility options to get my loved ones and I there. I have the equipment to be able to to grow a little bit of food, at least a calorie dense food to keep my family alive, because tubers like potatoes can be put in the ground and preserved ease. I don't need all that other crap of canning and and bottling and all that other equipment that's probably not going to exist for me. But the end of the day is, if you want to go there, there is a methodology to survive the nuclear detonation and bring you and your family through the other end of it. The preparations are clear. You have to you have to be able to survive those 14 days by blocking off air and have food, water, and sanitation to survive that. The Day After is a great 1980s movie about a family who did that, and the realistic sanitation problems that go along with you're all in one room and you're all using the bathroom, and you got to be able to store that 2 weeks worth of you using the bathroom in a room. It's just understand it's a lot more complicated than you think, and getting out. The point of this whole episode was to just understand that these implications of Putin's war are far, far reaching. The world as we know it just took a giant leap towards a very new existence. So I hope what you heard today was helpful. I hope that our discussion about mental health, the actual threats of nuclear event, the effects of the supply chain in your exposure, the effects in your life, and how you actually live in and fight through a nuclear event, and what the world looks like on the other end, was helpful. In the end, all of these world events just remind you that you are responsible for your outcomes, that your exposure to the world and the ability for things happening in the world to influence your ability to execute life as you want to, that level of exposure is your choice. It's absolutely your choice, and there's nothing wrong with it. It's just you understanding that if you don't want events like this in Ukraine to have a profound influence on your family's ability to thrive, not only survive, but thrive, then you have to make the decisions to make sure the insulating steps are taken. So thank you very much for listening to this week's episode on Inside My Canoe Head. Please take the time to send us your thoughts at jeff@preparednesslabs.ca. Get set up. There'll be a lot more details about the hard launch of Inside My Canoe Head across all social media platforms on the 28th of April this year. Thanks again for all the listeners, for all of my listeners in Eastern Europe and other threat parts of the world. I sincerely hope that you are able to find whatever peace the world offers you. And if you are an individual taking up arms to fight tyranny around the world, go get them. Go get them. Watch all the Jack Valax stuff you can on the internet to get yourself pumped up, and go. Let's do the business. Take care, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.